So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome and good evening. Thank you for coming here on this freezing cold day. Snugly and warm in here now. So welcome to Aga Khan University Institute for the Study of Muslim Civilizations. It's a delight to welcome Professor Aaron Hughes to speak on the subject of the study of Islam in an age of Trump, Notes from the Field. Professor Hughes is the Philip S.Bernstein Professor at the University of Rochester in New York. He's recently published a monograph, Shared Identities, Medieval and Modern Imaginings of Judeo-Islam, as well as a biography of Yaqub Nusna and Islam and the Tyranny of Authenticity. Professor Hughes, thank you very much.
I'm actually going to stand so that I can see you all and you can see me. Before I begin, though, I'd just like to thank Phil Wood for the kind invitation to come over to Aga Khan University and speak to everybody. I think that the title is, I hope the paper lives up to the title, right? It's such a great title that I'll let you be the judge, but don't tell me. So again, it's a pleasure to be here, and I would say that this is actually a fairly, as someone from Edmonton, Alberta, this is a summer day. So if I slowly start to take off parts of my clothing, it's because it's warm. Okay. So let me begin. In October of 1921, Muhammad Ali ibn Khalil al-Najdi, a young Shi'i, set out on a journey from his village just south of Tyre in search of his love, a Christian girl who had recently been sent by her family to Detroit for fear of upsetting familial honor. The young Muhammad traveled from the Levant to Mexico, erroneously believing it was close to Detroit. Making his way northwards based on the kindness of strangers and a good business sense that would come to his aid not infrequently throughout his long life, he was able, remarkably, to track her down. She had been working in a restaurant in Dearborn. I'm not sure if any of you have been to Dearborn, but it's probably the best Lebanese food in America. I think there's better places in Canada, but that's a debate. So she'd been working in a restaurant in Dearborn, just outside of Detroit, but young Muhammad, much to his chagrin, discovered that the girl's family had betrothed her to another, not surprisingly a co-religionist. Not to be deterred, he made his way north to Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, where he would eventually meet a young Jewish woman by the name of Miriam Horowitz, who was trying to escape an unhappy life there with her family. They wed after a quick courtship and moved much farther north to the Canadian Arctic, to Fort Simpson. I bet no one here has heard of Fort Simpson. In the Northwest Territories. They lived some 2,000 kilometers from the north of the Canadian-U.S. border, on an island at the confluence of the Mackenzie and Liard rivers, which, given its geography, not surprisingly, functioned as a popular trading spot between white traders and the indigenous Dene First Nation. The Canadian authorities, unfamiliar with the cadences of Arab names, had renamed him, christened him, if you will, as Bud Alley, A-L-L-E-Y. Someone who would go on to become a very successful fur trader, both in Fort Simpson and beyond. Indeed, his success was based primarily on his kindness in dealing with indigenous inhabitants, who preferred to deal with him on account of his fairness than they did with the Hudson's Bay Company, who eventually bought him out of business. At this point, Bud Alley, my grandfather, moved to Edmonton. There, as one of the few successful Arab businessmen in that young city, he supplied the money to create Canada's first mosque, Masjid al-Rashid, perhaps not surprisingly a Sunni mosque, which officially opened its doors on December 12, 1938. More family came over, people married, both other Muslims, non-Muslims, they had families. Some became farmers in southern Alberta, Lebanese farmers on the Canadian prairies in the 1940s. Imagine that, eh? One, Ali Asadi, had an affair with the president of Pakistan before marrying him. Larry Shaban, another, was elected to the Alberta Provincial Legislature in 1975, becoming the first Arab elected in Alberta and among the first Muslims elected to higher political office in North America. Another, a grandson, namely me, has an endowed chair in Jewish studies at a major American university. Why do I mention all this? I assure you that it is not to establish my own Abrahamic bona fides, a category which I have been exceedingly critical over the years. On the contrary, my rationale is simple. Indeed, we could say ridiculously simple. It is to remind us, if in fact we need reminding, and it seems to me at our current geopolitical moment we do in fact need reminding, that Muslims are human. They have dreams, they fall in love, they care about their children, their businesses, and their communities. They dare to dream beyond boundaries, nor are they limited by the boundaries imposed upon them. Their agency is independent of the narratives we nowadays construct about them and around them. They cannot, in other words, simply be described using monikers such as Arab or Muslim. Individuals like my grandfather, and he is certainly not sui generis. If he would only be of personal and nostalgic interest, and not analytic utility, helped to build Canada. And they form an intricate part of Canada's national fabric. But none of this should come as a surprise to any of us here tonight. Indeed, the comment is so obvious that in 2017, I can't believe such a point has to be made, let alone defended. However, at present in the United States, in Europe, and among a certain dark underbelly in my own country of Canada, Muslims, in quotation marks, functions as a code for all that is incongruous with putative Western values. We know the litany of complaints. Muslims stick together, we keep welcoming them, but it's clear they don't want to be part of our country, of our system. They take but don't give back. They want to set up their Sharia courts that contravene our own secular judicial branch, and the list goes on and on. Once again, at the risk of belaboring an obvious point, such statements are so ludicrous as to be, if the consequences were not so real, a parody, or at least a textbook example of how the West imagines others, and in so doing replicates a false sense of itself. Indeed, we have seen the exact same arguments applied to a host of minorities over the years, perhaps none more consistently and cumulatively than that directed towards Jews, which culminated in the middle of the previous century, and we all know, without having to rehearse here, the murderous consequences of such discourses. Nor do we have to be students of psychology or post-colonialism to know that social groups need others with which to construct themselves and their imagined values. However, we might do well to pause here for a moment and ask ourselves, just what are Western values? Who gets to decide? When were they created? And what intellectual, social, and judicial role do they play in our collective consciousness? Social theorists remind us, for example, that identities are never static, nor discrete, but always fluid as groups bump up against one another and imagine and reimagine, define and redefine themselves in the process of such encounters. To quote from the late Edward W. Said, whose presence will make several appearances in my talk, I quote, "The real question is whether in the end we want to work for civilizations that are separate, or whether we should be taking the more integrative but perhaps more difficult path, which is to see them as making one vast whole whose exact contours are impossible for any one person or to grasp, but whose certain existence we can intuit and feel." End of quote. Western values, of course, only begin to take on form and definition once we imagine what their opposites, so-called non-Western values, are. The latter can then be neatly put in counterpoint with the former, and, quelle surprise, found to be woefully wanting. If Judaism functioned as the opposite of Christian Europe in the pre-modern world, this pride of place in the modern world is reserved for Islam. This tradition now becomes a cavernous darkness onto which we can project any number of hostile and misinformed attributions. Muslim bodies are now synonymous with insecurity, danger, and risk. Female Muslim bodies threaten our democratic and aesthetic sensibility, and the male Muslim body threatens to subsume us with its perceived appetite for no, that's the food. Wanton and I'm hungry, it's dinner time. Wanton and irrational violence. we inscribe our own fears and desires not only on Islam then, but also on the very flesh of Muslims we see both on our screens and in our streets. Now the question I wish to address here this afternoon, however, is what role the academic study of Islam plays in all of these imaginings. Does it help or hinder, correct or exacerbate these types of negative images? My answer, to be fleshed out in what follows, is that the academic study of Islam, and here I should be clear, I mean the politically correct and largely uncritical version of Islamic studies, of which I have been critical over the years, contributes to the problem because it possesses an intrinsic tendency toward essentialism. In its desire to correct negative stereotypes, this type of Islamic studies, paradoxically to be sure, further reifies Muslims, and the process helps to create the very category Islam, into which individuals can either be neatly placed or denied entry. In so doing, Islamic studies, at least in its American context, and I'll leave it up to you to decide whether my argument rings true both here or on the continent, is in the business of constructing good Islam and bad Islam, good Muslims and bad ones. Bruce Lincoln, one of the most important theorists writing today, not in Islamic studies but in religious studies, where I have my academic home, has issued a set of theses that he believes should guide a critical, and I underscore critical, academic study of religion. Not unlike Luther's act 500 years ago, Lincoln has nailed symbolically, if not literally, a set of criticisms on the entrance to our collective guild. I wish to focus in particular on the 13th and final of his theses, which reads as follows. When one permits those whom one studies to define the terms in which they will be understood, suspends one's interest in the temporal and the contingent, or fails to distinguish between truths, truth claims, and regimes of truth, one has ceased to function as a historian or scholar. In that moment, a variety of roles are available, some perfectly respectable, such as amanuensis, collector, friend, and advocate, and some less appealing, cheerleader, voyeur, retailer of import goods, etc. None, however, should be confused with scholarship. End of quote. Now this confusion, it seems to me, is a real problem in the American Academy, and one that only gets worse when confronted by the types of over-the-top rhetoric that we currently hear from right-wing demagogues. If there is one takeaway from Shahab Ahmed's recent celebrated and posthumously published What is Islam, is that he too recognized this tendency in contemporary Islamic studies. In our desire to define what is Islam and what is not, what is Islamic and what is its inverse, Ahmed argues that we often lose sight of Muslim lives and the complex and often contradictory ways in which Muslims make sense of their worlds, and in ways that do not neatly fall into Islam and non-Islam. Can, Ahmed rhetorically or even playfully asks us, be a Muslim wine drinker? One hears Salafi preachers, neoconservative Western political commentators, and many scholars of Islam simultaneously provide an answer to this question in the negative. For a Muslim to drink wine, all of the above would agree, is surely to go against the tenets of Islam. Yet, Ahmed encourages us to suspend what we think we know about Islam, to unlearn that which we have learned, and instead imagine how the act of imbibing wine can be positively valued using non-legal discourses or terms of reference. Islam, on his reading, becomes more than simply a religion in the Western constructed sense of the term, and more than just a set of interlocking legal or cultural forms. His analysis, and this is where I find the book useful, upends a particular history of thinking, upends a particular history of framing Islam, a history that has been constructed for various political and ideological purposes as much as anything we might label as intellectual. It is a history, moreover, that has always been predicated on an intricate system of inclusions and exclusions. And what gets to count and what not, or does not get to count, is never just based on a natural or an objective set of categories. The present is certainly no different from the past. Here we must acknowledge that the Western study of Islam has always been a politically fraught field. It has always carried out academic activities in the shadow of political expedience. Islamic studies then constructs, absorbs, and resists political discourses. It is the latter, this resistance, that I wish to focus on here. For in resisting such discourses, a certain type of Islamic studies, the one I've been critical of, opens itself up to a monothetic reading of the tradition, often in the name of advocacy or apologetics. Calls to the contrary of those who purvey this type of apologetic or advocacy, it is not a natural act, but again one that is heavily invested in the political. Indeed, the current gravitational pull towards identity politics makes the study of Islam, as indeed many other religions, no less a detriment to the field than right-wing political discourses. Indeed, they mutually embrace one another, and together they form a set of discourses that must be resisted. So Islam as a social, cultural, intellectual, aesthetic, and religious form is so potentially amorphous that any concept of Islam, again to invoke Ahmed, must denote and connote all possible Islams, whether abstract or real. This denotation and connotation, however, is lacking, awfully woefully lacking, in either political or academic discourses. Both, I suggest, work on the assumption that there is one Islam, be it bellicose on the one hand, or predicated on some amorphous and anachronistic category, such as gender justice or social justice on the other, that defines the tradition to the exclusion of other forms of belief, practice, or simply being in the world. I fear that many in Islamic studies, even the most liberal-minded, are not unlike conservative political commentators in that both force Muslims to perform their identities in ways with which they may well not be comfortable. Muslims of whatever stripe, denomination, or level of observance are forced to renounce terror around the globe, or when committed by rogue elements over here. If they do not, they are somehow imagined to be complicit in such acts. In so doing, the modern West, and here both hostile politicians and well-meaning academics paradoxically converge and draw inspiration from over a millennium of thinking about Islam. They desire to transform such social actors into Muslims. Islam now becomes a discrete and essentialized category that admits of neither subtlety nor nuance. We manufacture this tradition in our Western universities, disseminate it in our writings, and act surprised when our politicians pick away at certain threads and begin to unravel what we thought we had nuanced. Can we be surprised to learn then that we have created, inherited, and continue to deploy categories and terms of reference whereby others are forced to define themselves? We do not have to be nuanced anthropologists to acknowledge that where indigenous populations are frequently content to perceive overlapping identities and live both in and with complexity, we demand strict adherence to the categories that we have invented and then assume to be natural markers. This, of course, is an intellectual variation on the theme sounded by the Sykes-Picot Agreement over a century ago. We carve up regions without even a passing nod to the specters of ambiguity or indeterminacy, let alone local inhabitants, and adjudicate what goes where and who goes where. Whereas other groups interpret their world, we, in an act of utter hubris, demand that our categories are not only natural, but divinely inspired. The result is pretty much the same everywhere. Nameless, faceless Muslims are denied autonomy and agency, except, of course, when they are committing acts of violence against other nameless, faceless Muslims, or against people with names and faces, namely us. But how does the academic study of religion fit into and contribute to all of this? Or, framed differently, here I guess an indication of Bob Dylan, how do we rearrange their faces and supply them with new names? As I've tried to argue elsewhere, the study of religions is still largely a Protestant endeavor, defining religion as something internal, non-political, and nonviolent, except of course when hijacked or corrupted by external forces. This Protestant orientation becomes the default for many who work in the study of religions and aids in the bifurcation of so-called authentic religious forms and so-called inauthentic religious forms. So this means that scholars of religion in general, and of Islam in particular, have entered, whether consciously or not, the political fray of getting to decide or adjudicate who or who is not a good Muslim, or who is not a good religious practitioner. But I'm not sure that this is a place where scholars of religion or scholars of Islam want to be or even need to be. As I hope to show here, however, the more the study of Islam is implicated by and in the current political moment, the more ridiculous and introverted it can become. Many will invoke, for example, Edward Said's critique of Orientalism, but continue in the attempt to, one, expose the ideological, I didn't want a but there, I want an and there, so let me read that sentence again. Many will invoke, for example, Said's criticism of Orientalism and continue in the attempt to, one, do what he did, which is expose the ideological underpinnings of Western category formation, and two, to show how such categories have historically deprived Muslim actors of their agency. I have no problem with any of this. In fact, I actively encourage such forms of analysis, right? We should all look at the categories that we've used to construct how we got here and why we do things. And in fact, I've done this in a number of venues, including my Abrahamic religions, where I've tried to unpack the very category of Abrahamic religion. So we have an obligation to interrogate critically the intellectual genealogies of the fields in which we work. And such interrogation is indeed both a very healthy and, I would say, a necessary activity. However, it has to be applied systematically across the board. We can't accuse others of being invested in the so-called political, all the while ignoring our own investitures in ideological motivations and machinations. In like manner, we cannot say that our own identities, or the identities of those we study, is complicated, and then simply write off as inconsequential, or worse, the identities of those of whom we're critical. While many, and I shall bring some egregious examples to bear in my argument shortly, are quick to point out that the Orientalist treatment of Islam in Western scholarship, they are often unaware of the problems inherent to reverting to the very Western, read Protestant, assumption about what gets to count as good, real, or authentic Islam and what does not. The result is, as in the construction of Orientalism, of which they are so critical, the deprivation of agency to Muslim actors. There is a real irony, in other words, when we see the reappearance of Orientalist assumptions emanate from the very same scholarly circles that, at least when it suits them, are willing to point out the political and ideological undertones of the representation of the other, especially the Muslim other. Okay. Now, when we throw into this intellectual/political amalgam the current leadership in Washington, we encounter real problems, and not just theoretical and taxonomical ones. It is a political world, one in which, to again invoke last year's Nobel laureate, Dylan, in which wisdom is thrown in jail, it rots in a cell, and misguided as hell, leaving no one to pick up its trail. I still recall an email I once received from Daniel Pipes. I don't know if anyone here has heard of Daniel Pipes. He is the founder of Campus Watch, neoconservative, and the neoconservative sentinel of appropriate discourses on Islam and Israel. Right? It's Islam and Israel, they always go hand in hand in American political discourses. He asked me, long before the thought of, let alone the reality of a Trump presidency, if I would attend, all expenses paid, plus a handsome, and I mean really handsome, honorarium, and go to certain panels at the annual meeting of the Middle Eastern Studies Association, or MESA, that he would choose in advance and that I would write about, presumably with some kind of slant that would suit him and his organization. Again, I promise this is my last invocation Dylan. I've just been listening to him a lot lately, but he has this great line where he says, money doesn't talk," to end this paragraph with a quote, "it screams." And I think that's, the amount these neoconservative think tanks or groups, they have a lot of money, not just in Islamic studies, but in Jewish studies circles too. And again, they always revolve around the same question, which is Israel, and safe to be Israel, and protecting it from, we don't have to reverse here. So I think this one anecdote is revealing for a number of reasons. First, it shows, and I think rather obviously, so there's little reason to belabor the point, just how the study of Islam is encroached by various right-wing, or using the nom de jour, neoconservative political actors. This seems to stem from the unfounded fear that the study of Islam produces people who are appreciative of Islam, which is not surprising that it shouldn't do that. Second, I find it interesting that because I have been critical of some of the regnant discourses in Islamic studies in the North American context as too apologetic and unscholarly, Daniel Pipes and his Campus Watch accomplices were somehow aware of this, and they seem to work on that age-old adage from Middle Eastern realpolitik that the enemy of my enemy must by definition be my friend. Third, this action on the part of these right-wing or neoconservative social actors, I don't know what else to call them without resorting to bad language, must necessarily engender a reaction. Such a reaction, however, and this is, I think, my main point here tonight, is one that recycles, by virtue of the fact that it is a response, the same problematic terms and categories. It should also be clear that none of this concerns of our American colleagues who are convinced that they are currently living at the end of times. To the contrary, is necessarily new nor even unprecedented. Another invocation of Said should remind us all that Euro-America has been attempting to think with and regulate Muslim bodies for quite some time. The current obsession with what Muslim women can or cannot, ought or ought not to wear, or the xenophobic discourses about refugees and migration is but the latest iteration of this project. What is new now, however, is the outright threat to Muslims in Europe and North America. Muslims are the excuse to bring fascistic-leaning political parties out of the dark recesses in which they have been festering and into the mainstream. Muslims, again nameless, faceless, and displaced because of acts of violence that they perpetrate on one another, are constructed as a threat to white Christian Europe or white Christian America. The regulations on Muslims, as imagined by Executive Order 13769, titled Protecting the Nation from Foreign Terrorist Entry into the United States, but more commonly and simply referred to as the Muslim ban, makes a mockery of universal human rights, let alone stands in violation of that notoriously problematic and uniquely American of documents, which I still don't know what it is, the Constitution. Yes. The Trump administration, of course, is not manufacturing all of this, nor is it simply creating a discourse from scratch. Instead, it is tapping into and responding to a present mood about Islam and about Muslims that is as inaccurate as it is disturbing. The discourse seems to create us, if you'll allow me to channel the specter of Michel Foucault for a few seconds, as much as we create it. Islam and Muslims, according to the script, represent a collective threat to our, whomsoever we are, is never entirely clear, values, democracy, well-being, way of life, security, and so on. Muslims are to be feared, pathologized, categorized into good and bad based on various political alliances, and when and where appropriate, simply banned. The question we need to ask ourselves is, now this is what I'm interested in, how does the tendency in Islamic studies to differentiate between good and bad Muslims contribute to this, or even bleed over into non-academic discourses? It is easy to see how scholars of Islam respond to those who are critical of Islam for political expediency. And there I congratulate them. I don't think there's a problem with that. Another question I'm always fascinated in is, how do politicians respond to us? And here it might be worth mentioning, at least in an American context, is that the FBI considers political scientists and sociologists to be credible witnesses and give expert testimony. However, it doesn't grant the same courtesy to scholars of religion, which is, I'm not sure why. Is it because scholars of religion, within whose genus we must certainly lump the overwhelming majority of scholars of Islam in America, that they insist on terms of reference to invoke Lincoln that are so apologetic and ecumenical as to be largely unbelievable? Right? It might be like bringing a priest or a rabbi or an imam to give expert witness. I think articulating this in broad strokes, as I've tried to do here, is the easy part. I now want to go a step further and ask, once again, what role has the academic study of Islam played in all of this? Now, I don't refer simply to the Orientalist tradition, of which it has become fashionable to undermine in certain intellectual circles as of late. Instead, I want to put under the microscope the more recent, and I've said, a more trendy approach to Islam, one that isn't particularly critical, and one that seeks to offer an antidote to what are perceived to be the excesses of Orientalism. The term that some of my colleagues have used to denote this, and here they invoke the philosopher Kwame Anthony Appiah, is cosmopolitanism. Cosmopolitanism would, on first blush, appear to be the type of direction in which my argument is headed. We do, after all, get along better when we realize our interconnections and work in tandem to make the world a better place for all of its citizens. But if Orientalism is an academic term, what is cosmopolitanism? The latter certainly does not seem to be an analog to the former, nor does it function intellectually in the same manner. If Orientalism is about pre-modern texts, and when done properly, and I would be the first to admit the many excesses it has produced over the years, is often critical, what is cosmopolitanism? Modern, post-textual, and what? Moreover, and now I speak as a scholar of religion, concepts in 25-cent words like cosmopolitanism have the habit of invoking non-critical analyses and a liberal theological deference to the ecumenical or the interfaith. If by cosmopolitanism we mean, as many do in religious studies, a pluralism of non-critical, non-skeptical, and insider approaches, then I think we're in trouble. Let me give you an example. In a recent work entitled Rethinking Islamic Studies, and tellingly subtitled From Orientalism to Cosmopolitanism, Carl Ernst and Richard Martin invoke Appiah. They inform us that, quote, that cosmopolitanism is, quote, the foundation of Appiah's vision of a harmonious, globalized social order based on pluralism and tolerance, end of quote. Fair enough. I have no problem with any of that. I mean, who here doesn't prefer tolerance to intolerance, or pluralism to monism and exclusivity? But then we might ask, what I hope you'll agree with me, is the next or follow-up question to that. What does this term mean intellectually, and what does its invocation mean for scholarship? Which is, by definition, I think, supposed to be critical. Not undermining, but critical. Is cosmopolitanism a slogan or a hermeneutic? My argument is that cosmopolitanism, whatsoever it may mean, no less exoticizes Islam and Muslims than Orientalism does, precisely because it too denies to Muslims autonomy and agency. So let me look at some responses. Every action, as I stated, precipitates a reaction. I sound like Bob Marley. And it is, goodness. It is that reaction that I want to examine in greater detail. Allow me now, in the time that remains, to give a few examples of what I think scholars who are critical of Orientalism have in mind when they say they seek to dislodge Orientalism and replace it with an altogether different set of interpretive lenses. And I don't really see myself as standing up here trying to be one of the final, or a defender of Orientalism. I'm not trying to do that, but I do think it's Orientalism's ability to privilege texts and to be able to read texts in their original language is something that people that I'm often critical of aren't able to do. But again, with the caveat that Orientalism has created many problems. Now, I promised you that I will speak of the study of Islam in an age of Trump, I have to confess that I'm neither an expert in American politics nor its domestic policies. I do, however, have an abiding interest, and this is why I titled the talk what I did, in the manner whereby such policies influence disciplinary configurations. This is my concern. The sociology of knowledge, and by extension the sociology of ignorance, instructs us that there exists an intimate relationship between human thought and lack thereof and the social context within which it arises. There is then no world out there waiting to be discovered in an unmediated fashion. On the contrary, knowledge and ignorance are shaped, imagined, manufactured, and disseminated according to established social and cultural frames of reference, and of course, political expediency. This misunderstanding is perhaps the most obvious and the easiest to document. But what I want to do in the time that remains is look at the fallout of this in the academic study of Islam. How does it offer a response to such geopolitical configuration, or geopolitical events? So the question for me, to reiterate, is what is the role of the study of Islam in all of this? For even a rejection of political categories and discourses, no matter how tacit, ultimately signals their embrace. So in order to nudge this conversation along a little, allow me to wax a little more autobiographical. So the musings for my talk today were precipitated and inspired by a particular event. Early this summer, I interviewed for a chair in Jewish studies at a major university in the United States. After I presented my so-called job talk on the Jews with whom Muhammad might have come into contact, I was informed, not asked, but informed, in the question and answer period, you know it's never going to go well, by a potential colleague in Islamic studies, that we already know from the Sirah literature that two of Muhammad's wives were Jewish, so why would I bother to interrogate the matter? When I tried to respond that the Sirah is problematic chronologically for a number of reasons, another potential colleague, an anthropologist in modern Indonesia, and as I later found out, a convert to Islam, informed me, again informed, not asked, that radiocarbon dating proves that the Quran dates the period the tradition ascribes to it. I love the attempt to prove faith by recourse to science. But it was a job interview. What am I going to say? So I had to be... So I tried to point out that, radiocarbon dating has a margin of error that could make the Quran later, and that such dating tells us only the age of the parchment or the vellum and not necessarily the script. But it fell on deaf ears because I would soon learn nuance was in short supply in that room. But politics of the identarian variety, among others, was not. To top it all off, I learned later another colleague who never once introduced herself to me during the interview, and this is a job talk in Jewish studies, wrote a letter to the search committee and the dean informing them that my talk insulted her as a Muslim woman and accused me of having a Zionist and or neoconservative agenda. You see, so this really got me thinking. First of all, it was so clear that for those of you who haven't been on the job market yet, but will potentially go on the job market, sometimes you just know. You just know that I need a job, but this is not this job. If I get this job, it's not going to go well. So that's. So I really try to figure out, from where such statements might derive. Are we really so sensitive in the current political moment? And notice this is what I said, right? Like, so her identity was complex, but I was just the white guy. I was the white Jew at the front of the white male Jew. And I think if anything, as I tried to show you in my autobiographical opening, I think I'm not. Right? Because only Jews can do Jewish studies. It becomes a parody of itself. As I always say to my students, there's you don't have to be a square to teach mathematics. Well, I'm sure there's a lot of squares in mathematics in my university. So are we really so sensitive in the current political moment that a critical and candid posture about what we realistically know, say about early Islam, and the problems associated with the early sources, becomes offensive to what are ostensibly other scholars. Is scholarship, like my female Muslims colleagues' feelings, only skin deep? Does political correctness, and I certainly don't mean this as a conservative critique of the term or concept. I don't mean it that way because it's now fashionable, right, in right-wing I guess by definition, right-wing conservative, in certain right-wing circles to talk about the political correctness in the academy, and I certainly disagree with those criticisms. But I just want to draw attention to some of the abuses of a really strong version of identity politics can lead. Is it a way to silence voices we don't want to hear, or modes of scholarly analysis that makes us uncomfortable? Allow me to invoke another example that plays off of this, one that, as I trust you will agree with me, speaks volumes to this type of uncritical and politically correct type of approach. In the first Muslims, Asma Afsar-ud-Din argues that the Prophet Muhammad preached, quote, a message of social justice and gender egalitarianism, end quote, that was subsequently subverted by white male elites, that's my term, not hers, in the medieval period, but that's her basic argument. Without getting into the thorny issue of presentism and whether or not social justice and egalitarianism even existed before the 1970s, we might step back and ask ourselves what she is trying to attempt with such a statement. Does she really believe this to be the case? I assume she does because she wrote about it. If so, what sources is she using? Presumably the same ones that all of us must use in order to deal with early Islam. But these sources pose no problems for her, and she just feels that she has to read them, and read them well, and then tell us, and read them as if they're transcripts of what really happened. But as anyone knows who works on the topic of Islamic origins, these sources offer a number of political and chronological problems. And I think, if anything, Philip mentioned the Jacob Neuster biography. It was Jacob Neuster that really pioneered this method in Jewish studies. And I think increasingly this work needs to be done more in Islamic studies. So these sources that she uses as transcripts actually date from a later period and comment on what they think or wanted to happen. So as opposed to join in, she calls those people, myself included, that work on these sources and try to show how they are potentially problematic, she calls us, contrary to, quote, the assertion of the minority rejectionist camp, which has based its contrarian position on its own tendentious reading of the sources and unsubstantiated speculations, end of quote. She lumps herself in with those careful and responsible scholars, end of quote, who read the sources with, again, quote, careful and judicious scrutiny, end of quote. You see the problem. I pointed out white non-Muslim men run roughshod, according to Afsar-ud-Din, over the sensibilities of a non-white Muslim woman. This returns us to the problem I encountered in the interview at this unnamed American university. Heck, I can't even tell you the name of the university. They're so ridiculous, but I'm not going to do that right now. The American Academy, which loves charges of white male privilege, swirls in the background like a tornado in the distant horizon, spoken like a prairie person like I am. Now, know what she is doing. One is a careful scholar if one agrees with her, and is tendentious if one admits that there might be certain chronological or other problems with the biographical and other early sources. This, of course, was not unlike what Martin and Ernst were doing in their bait and switch, using a pejoratively and unfairly constructed Orientalism and replacing it with a more positively framed but equally constructed Cosmopolitanism. Pressed, they would say there is nothing political about their project. But we all know that we live in a political world, and no one can venture beyond political. What others do is invested in theology, in other words, but what we do is simply a natural activity. I lived in Jerusalem at the time when the Bible Code just came out. It was translated into Hebrew as Hasofen HaTanachi, or the Bible Code. And now this book claims that encoded deep in the biblical text are a series of codes that predicted later events, such as I think the most famous example is the predicted the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin, prime minister. At the time when the book was translated, the chief Ashkenazic rabbi of Israel issued a statement which in typical Hebrew directness basically said, if you have to lie to people to get them to believe, what's the point? Well, I worry that we're heading in a direction where truth is the first casualty. There is a tendency to invoke normative and descriptive statements that deprive and have the potential to obscure or misrepresent as much as anything constructed by Orientalism. Since when is looking at early Islamic sources and being aware of the problems surrounding them a tendentious activity? Or again, since when is an approach that wants to look seriously at the origins of Islam being labeled a contrarian position? Contrary to what and contrarian to whom? Moreover, why must such an analysis be based on unsubstantiated speculations? Again, unsubstantiated to what or to whom? Perhaps rather than label Islamic origins as an activity in which a bunch of angry old white guys engage, it might be profitable to reframe the conversation. Rather than avoid the topic altogether as something that insults the feelings of Muslims, be it academic or non-academic, a responsible approach to Islamic origins provides us with tremendous insights into a very fluid period of Western history. Late antiquity in general, and the late antique Arabian Peninsula in particular. Islam on such a reading is not the simple sum of other monotheistic parts. Rather, its emergence functions as the catalyst for, among other things, the firming up of orthodoxies and other traditions. These are not the discrete traditions of subsequent periods, but represent, again, a moment of fluidity as ideas and those who held them circulated wide and freely. How is this tendentious or contrarian? Indeed, if anything, it situates Islam smack dab in the middle of the so-called West. It neither privileges it nor exoticizes it. Such an approach takes Islamic traditions more seriously than those who want to focus on, say, the early community's friendliness to gays and lesbians, or to its social justice and gender egalitarianism. The latter topics are less about intellectual or historical integrity and more about theological turf wars between rival Islams in the present that use quasi-academic jargon, of religious studies. In this, they are certainly connected to the current political moment. If right-wing politicians say that Islam has no gender equality, what better thing to do than write about how it was and presumably still is? Likewise, if Islamophobes suddenly take up the charge of gay rights and point to the abhorrent treatment of homosexuals in ISIS-controlled territories or in Chechnya, what better than for academics to say that such individuals misunderstand their own beautiful tradition? But as I hope you might agree with me, such academic presentations come with their own sets of issues. So let me conclude. I began this lecture by invoking my grandfather, Muhammad Ali ibn Khalil al-Nejdi, and his journey to Canada in 1922. I did this for a number of reasons. The first is to make the obvious point that Muslims have been in Canada and North America for a very long time. And this, of course, doesn't include the Muslim slaves that were forcefully taken to America long before that. Muslims are not just refugees or migrants. They are also builders and quite literally the architects of our countries. They are our doctors, our politicians, and our lawyers and our professors. They are literally as Canadian as I am, and I am literally as Arab as they are. Second, it shows just how potentially ludicrous Islamic studies can become unless regarded carefully. In many circles, and I use this as my primary example, the study of Islamic origins, which I think has a great deal to illumine Western civilization, is actually seen as verboten. This is in direct response to attempts to undermine Islam on the part of political commentators, many of whom, rather surprisingly, and this is, I think, the interesting part, read the Orientalist literature of yesteryear on the emergence of Islam. And if you go to any, at least in America or Canada, if you go to bookstores in the Islam section, often the books that are in there are Orientalist reprints edited by Ibn Warraq. But as I tried to show, it is no longer intellectually profitable nor sustainable to invoke the types of essays from the 1880s or 1920s that are in those books. Because all those essays seem to work on models that assume that religion in the 6th or 7th century Arabia was somehow more stable than the fledgling Islam was. This model of the old Orientalism, the model that depends on the metaphor employed, imagines Islam as either some of their parts or their sinful and illegitimate offspring. But I don't think that holds anymore. Such a model is both ideologically inflected and based on the retroactive projections of later centuries. Third, it shows how, returning to Said, we're all intimately connected to one another. Critical scholarship can and must be an important part of Islamic studies. When we ignore certain topics on account of their potential to hurt people's feelings or offend, we're in trouble. What's the alternative? Lies and half-truths peddled by modern-day sophists. Fourth, and this is the main point of my talk, ecumenical and theological ramblings and their concomitant gravitation to certain topics and their avoidance of others are isomorphically tied to the political space we inhabit. This space constructs Muslims as others, as dangerous, and as foreign. Many, but by no means all, modern scholars of Islam unfortunately respond by going overboard in the opposite direction. The result, however, is much the same. Again, these sort of essentialized ideas of what is Islam, what is good Islam, etc. Finally, allow me to add that the critical and analytical study of Islam benefits us all. It shows us, both Muslim and non-Muslim, the heights to which historical actors have imagined their tradition. It shows us that Islam is an intricate part of Western civilization, whatsoever that may be, and is neither its illegitimate child nor its psychological other. Our current political moment, one of fear and distrust, of anger and xenophobia, as worrisome as it may be, cannot hold. The study of Islam has the potential to take an active role in shaping popular opinion of Islam. But this role must eschew simplistic and apologetic formulations, ones predicated simply on responding to ignorant formulations. For such responses, by virtue of the very fact that they are responses, internalize that to which they respond. This does not mean that the study of Islam must simply carry on as if nothing were amiss. Instead, it must frame the conversations by, among other things, complicating Islam and Muslim lives, as I tried to do with my grandfather, and even just me, not that I'm not Muslim, but just to show that, I mean, it's complicated. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Hughes, for illustrating some of the dangers of our wish for simple or reified categories that apparently make the world straightforward to comprehend, but actually trap us in illusions in prisons of our own making. I think seeing Islam neither as an illegitimate child nor a psychological other is a very important first step for all our analysis of Islamic origins in particular, but also all of Islamic studies in general. I was very struck by your invocation of Ernst and Martin and their use of Appier's notions of cosmopolitanism. What seems to me that's missing in their treatment of Appier is that, well, I believe when I read Appier, that he's thinking of cosmopolitanism operating in an environment with a civil society, where journalists and academics and teachers hold those in power up to scrutiny. And included in that is not just scrutiny of government, but also scrutiny of any forms of authority, any forms of institution, anyone who seeks to speak on behalf of a community. And included, so therefore those parts of Islamic studies that try to protect Muslims from critical scrutiny, or protect Islamic origins from critical scrutiny, are to my mind sort of operating against the proper functioning of civil society. I wondered if I could ask you to reflect a little bit more on any lessons from how Jewish studies has matured in the United States and the position of Jews and the relationship to the academic study of Judaism and whether that might offer any lessons for what will happen in terms of Islamic studies.
Yeah, that's good. Let me answer that question with an anecdote. I always work on assumption an anecdote is worth 1,000 whatever. I started out in Islamic studies, and I was teaching at the University of Calgary in Western Canada. My first week on the job was the week of 9/11. And it wasn't in America. I was in a large urban Canadian university. And I began to be bothered by the fact that so many of my colleagues were doing all these hermeneutical somersaults to say what was good Islam, what was bad. I mean, they had to do it. I mean, I see where they came from. I mean, there's no, I'm not trying to, I always thought, though, as a religionist, we should kind of nuance that and say, well, you know, religions are complex things. There are these umbrellas under which sit various kinds of maximalist and minimalist voices. But you can't. So I became critical of that. I also had a couple of difficult incidences, and I began to, at this point I was working more in Jewish studies, which goes to your question. So I took up a position in Jewish studies in America, where I am now, and thinking that Jewish studies would be more open. Which in many ways it is, but I then came to an uncomfortable crossroads, whereas if one is critical of Israel in Jewish studies, one risks, there's a ceiling. And I'm extremely critical of Israel and its abhorrent treatment of Palestinians. And I vocalized this and I've written about it. And invitations started to dry up. I always joke I'm a scholar of Islam whose bills are paid by Jewish studies because there's more money in Jewish studies. So it's funny because I thought, when I originally thought that Jewish studies didn't have the same identity politics or the same agenda. It actually, I think, is as bad as, it's in fact worse than Islamic studies, because if anything, some of my critical work in Islamic studies now is being picked up by a young generation of Muslim scholars. So most of my invitations now are in Islamic studies, which is, I'm happy to be back in Islamic studies. So that anecdote, I think, shows us that, I mean, Jewish studies perceives itself to be in better shape than it actually is, as my experiences. But having said that, as we were talking earlier about, I wrote the biography of Jacob Neusner because I thought the biography of Jacob Neusner had to be written because he single-handedly created the field of Jewish studies in America, and not just America, but actually the world. In fact, the very reason we have the Oxford Center for Jewish Studies in Oxford was because Jacob Neusner not only helped create it, he even gave the money to create it. So he did a lot, but I think that Jewish studies, which I used to think was further ahead than Islamic studies, is actually going backwards. Whereas I think, so I think there's an atavism at the heart of Jewish studies, whereas I think Islamic studies is slowly beginning to, I think that 9/11 caused certain problems. I think that the field has had to deal with it. I think it's begun to deal with it, and I think it's now moving on to more critical work. And I think like Shahab Ahmed's book is a good example of this. So it's a long way of saying that 10 years ago I would have said that Islamic studies was about 80 years behind Jewish studies. I'm not so convinced anymore.
Thank you.
Sure. I don't know.
Yeah, sure. Karim,
yes. I just want your reflection. You highlighted several meta-structures which influence the way knowledge about Muslim Islam is shaped. You also talked about Foucault, Edward Said's. Do you think that there is a part of, and this is a reflection in a very frank mode, there is a sort of a quote-unquote laziness on part of academia and academics involved in studying Islam? Because this is how thinking from the ground operates, that, okay, what research topic I should craft which will attract funding?
Yeah.
Okay, so there are line of inquiries which are ethnographically relevant, but if I pitch that, even nobody would listen or pay attention to my proposal. It will be blocked before it reaches the committee. And hence, there is a responsibility on the part of academic scholar, and I would say universities, which became rigid to filter what is studied and what should not be studied.
Yeah.
So how to break this vicious circle, the nexus between economics and politics of knowledge, and the real fields of inquiries which would open up and decolonize methodologies and pluralistic discourse, and then there is no need to stay and emphasize that Muslims are human also.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
prove it through studies.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that's a great question. And then here, I can't really speak to the way funding works in the British universities. For my colleagues that I do know, I think it's a little bit more difficult than it is in North American institutions. But I would say that, yeah, we do need to break the way universities are structured, the way religious studies departments are structured. Certain topics, we gravitate towards certain topics and ignore others. I always joke that Americans are infatuated with themselves. And Canadians, we're not. In fact, in Canada, one never studies Canadians. One always has to go to India, Tibet, learn the languages, and then come back and do that. But I think that one way to humanize this is the, maybe I almost feel I should do this myself, but it'd be too autobiographical. But why aren't there dissertations written on these like Lebanese farmers in Tabor, Alberta? I mean, why aren't there dissertations written on Larry Shaban, my uncle, who was like really one of the first Muslim politicians in North America, and that I think this is the way to do it. And I think part of the way to do it, in my graduate seminar when I do theory, I say you can't use the category of religion. We have to find new ways to talk about religion because religion is such an amorphous category. How would we write some of these works without using the term Islam? And I think this is what Ahmed tries to encourage us to do. So I agree with you. I think we need to decolonize, we need to almost deorientalize in a way or decolonize the methods we use, but we can't replace them with this, because as I said, the response that we now see is just using the same categories, and it's making it equally difficult. So I agree. I mean, how do we do this? Let's do micro history or do local histories of this type of thing. Like, why aren't there books written on the mosque in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, which is one of the first mosques? Or why aren't there, gosh, one of the oldest Lebanese communities in Canada is a place called Lac La Biche in Alberta. I mean, why don't we have localized studies of this? Why aren't anthropologists or scholars of religion interested in this? That would be fascinating. So I don't know if that's a financial or economic issue, because I think anyone could, in Canada, you can just apply for the government to get the money. I think the Canadian government would love these types of things because they show official multiculturalism. So on the one hand, it's economic, but I think there's a lack of will.
So you accept.
All right. Would you accept that the Islamic scholars, the ulamas, the traditional ulamas, are deterrent to cosmopolitanism?
I missed the word.
Deterrent.
A deterrent?
The Islamic scholars, the ulamas, are deterrent to cosmopolitanism.
Well, it's an interesting question. I don't think they have to be, because I think so much of what goes on, like cosmopolitanism is an academic term, and I think so much of the academic study of religion occurs, either under the radar of or irrespective of what the ulama think. So I don't think there's very little connection. Although I love it how when I always use the example of maybe some of this, if you know Scott Siraj al-Haq Kugel, who is a your point is interesting, because I think some scholars of Islam, even though they have no training, see themselves as almost a self-styled liberal ulama. So, you have Scott Siraj al-Haq Kugel, who is a Muslim and is a gay man, who wrote a book on showing how the Quran in early Islam was hospitable to gays and lesbians. It's it's an interesting book. But see, what he's trying to do is write a work of, tafsir or fiqh to show how. But of course, the ulama aren't going to be interested in what he does at all. But he will do that under the guise of something like. In fact, I think he has an article in that book on from Orientalism to Cosmopolitanism. So I think that scholars of Islam can do academic scholars of Islam can do what they do. The ulama do what they do, and very rarely do they meet. Which I don't know if that's good or bad. I don't. But as I said, though, I think some of these academic scholars see themselves as like the liberal, the people that are leading the charge of a reformation in Islam. It's kind of ludicrous because no one pays any attention to them except themselves.
Well, thank you for this interesting talk. Really, I would like to ask you, to what extent do you think is the developing of the way of looking at Islamic studies is a kind of solo responsibility of West-based academia? What is the responsibility of the academia in the most different Muslim contexts, and how they are able, let's say, to develop a new way of looking at these kind of studies? So, I mean, universities in different parts of the Muslim world.
Yeah.
So, our academic people based on those contexts rather than being able to write in English or based in the Western context.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good question, and I think there has to be more. Increasingly, as I have more colleagues in the Islamic world, I'm really beginning to become interested in this. So I'm editing a book with a colleague in Freiburg who's an Iranian, and we're looking at the ways in which the categories, like we're using the traditional Arabic categories like Quran, Tafsir, Tasawwuf, etc., to show how there's differences between the way these terms are employed in the Islamic world traditionally, and then the way Orientalism usually renames them, and some of the tensions between that. So I think that's one way to go about this. But I agree. I think that most of the colleagues that I've now begun to work with in the Islamic world, I find them very receptive to my ideas, because I think they have the same problem with this stuff that I do. So these collaborations are potentially very exciting. So I think that our colleagues in the Islamic world can help us, and I think we can help them. And there has to be these connect. But again, this goes back to the theme of the talk. All these political bans, right? If you're critical of Israel, you can't go to Israel anymore. If you're critical, if you come from certain countries, you can't come to America anymore. It's just, we live in these silly times that it's becoming increasingly difficult to actually. So rather than, I mean, as much as I said I love the idea of cosmopolitanism, actually the way Philip describes it, but our world is becoming increasingly insular and myopic, and that it's so like Majid, my colleague that writing this book, he can't come to because he has a Persian Iranian passport. He can't come to the AAR, which is next week when we plan to sort of talk about things. And it's so I like your question. I like your point, and I think that there's a lot of room for that. And I'm thankful. And I think as I age, and I'm not the angry young white guy, as I become the just grumpy old guy, that I really appreciate the way Muslim colleagues in like Iran and in some of in the Arab world have reached out positively to my work, and I'm humbled actually.
Gentlemen, someone at the back.
Thank you for an interesting talk. I wanted to ask you a few things. Move away from Islamic studies to the study of Muslim civilizations might open more methodological avenues. The reason I ask is that, we keep talking about Islam as if Islam is an entity of its own, it has volition and agency. It's not Islam that does things Muslims would do. Maybe a shift in that approach might open more doors. And the reason I'm also asking is because you spoke about this monolith presentation of Islam. But when you look at anthropologists, they don't present Islam this way because their focus is on what Muslims do. And maybe more interdisciplinary approaches, searching for new hermeneutics, might open doors for better.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I mean that's all I can say is definitely. I think the names do a lot of work, and as I said, you're right. I mean, Islamic studies. It's a certain. I have no problem renaming it as a department. I mean, renaming it. I think anthropologists. Yeah. So I agree, and I'm assuming that I'm not sure how the way that it's structured here, but the very fact that you call Muslim civilizations, I'm assuming that there's probably more different types of methodologies as
I think disciplinary boundaries seem to be still tighter than one would like them to be.
Yeah, no, they always are, yeah. And it becomes, they become very, very difficult because the text people don't want, I mean, I always remember when I was learning Arabic and my Iraqi Arab teacher would say, I was going to the Center for Arabic Studies in Egypt, and he said, don't go, you'll come back speaking like a cab driver. And, so the textualists do their things, and anthropologists are bad, and anthropologists don't, and it's yeah. So I agree. I think that we need to think creative, which actually goes back to the gentleman's question at the back about as well. We need to think creatively about these, but I think it's hard to think creatively about it when there's such political overtones in the way we're police. Like look at Campus Watch, right? People that watch every. I mean, there are organizations. I'm not sure if you have the equivalent in Britain.
Yeah, the prevent strategy.
Yeah.
No.
We don't have.
I mean, people that literally, like students can write in about their professors.
Yeah, we have that away. It's called the prevent strategy.
I don't quite agree with that. That's the other way around.
No, I don't agree with. Oh, you don't agree that prevent strategy is equal?
It's rather different to Campus Watch.
Okay.
Yeah. Oh, at the back, please.
Can you hear me? Hello?
Yeah.
Is that okay? Yes. Okay. I just wanted to make a comment to the earlier question that was asked in your response. Talking about the Muslim intellectual, you know, when you look at the legal structures in many Muslim countries, to what extent is a Muslim intellectual able to engage in some of these issues without getting into trouble with the law, like blasphemy laws or laws that do not allow him to speak or her to speak on certain issues? And it's quite interesting and telling that many Muslim intellectuals have thought of new ideas have done it in the comfort of Western universities.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there's a dimension there. I want to know what you take on that.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. I know that some of my books where I've been critical of these things are being translated into Persian and into Arabic. So I mean, I can't speak directly to their situation over there, but I've had a number of contacts with people that seem to be intrigued by these types of issues. I don't know what kind of honestly, I can't say what they might what kind of issues, political or legal issues, they might face in their home countries, but the openness in these Muslim countries, I'm as I said, I'm flabbergasted, and I think that maybe it goes back to this idea of, because I'm critical of a particular Western tradition that seeks to liberalize Muslims or liberalize Islam, that maybe they're almost. I can see how certain, not just political conservatives in America, but also maybe even certain Muslim conservatives say, yeah, there is a problem with the way this is constructed, which just shows how all the strange bedfellows in these types of academic construction. So yeah, I take your point. Thank you.
Just as you were critical of some of the Muslim scholars, what's your view on the Shlomo Sand, you say, the Jew or invention of Jewish people or Israeli people? Can you let me know your views on that?
Well, I mean, yeah, I don't know. Shlomo Sand is an Israeli revisionist historian who wrote about the invention of the Jewish people. I can't actually remember what his argument is now, but that the Jews are a later invention. And I mean, I would say that we're all invented, right? I mean, all identities are invented, and in the wrong hands, certain arguments can be picked up in negative ways. So when I was teaching at the University of Calgary, I had a couple Muslim students that asked me that they heard that the Jews were only invented after the Holocaust. and I'm like, oh. So, I mean, you can see where that's going, right? So I would say, well, maybe the Israelis are invented, right? There's no Israelis before 1948, so the Israelis are invented, and then we always have right-wing Israelis or right-wing Americans say that the Palestinians are invented people. I say, you know what? I'll call the Palestinians an invented people too, but we have to acknowledge that the Israelis are also invented. So these are difficult, and his book caused a lot of problems. But I would say that Jewish identity today is much different than Jewish identity was pre-1948 or pre-1880, and I think that all groups go through these periods of imagining and reimagining themselves and inventing and reinventing themselves. And I think the problem is when we want to say, this is Judaism, or this is Islam. But it's an interesting book. I wouldn't go as far as he would, but I would argue that Judaism is reimagined, just as Islam is reimagined with every generation. And the example I always use, in 1960s America, to be an Orthodox, I think something like 25% of Orthodox Jews were Shomer Shabbos. That is, they didn't work on the Sabbath. They only ate kosher food. And now in Orthodox circles, I think it's something like 85%. So just these changes within 40, 50 years, the groups are always morphing and reimagining themselves.
But the new historian of Islam, Ilan Pape, to some extent agrees with him.
Yeah, I agree. They do, and I think all of them are. I mean, they're all revisionist historians, and I think many of them are critical.
They are new historian, not revision.
Yeah, well,
I would dispute with that.
Okay, all right. I'll have new historians, and yeah, I think that they're all politically they're on the same page. But I guess Shlomo Sands, again, I'm not. I'd have to refamiliarize myself. It's ages since I've read that book.
There are 3 books he has written.
Yeah, well, I probably know the guy who wrote the invention of.
Gentleman here.
Yes, sorry. So as an educator, I think we're always taught to think more long-term. So as I know you're highlighting current political issues, and what do you think the lasting effects of this is? So if we're in our classroom preparing students to kind of handle issues now and then also handle issues that will arise in the future, how do you think, do you think it's changing, or is this something that's going to carry on for a while?
Yeah, I mean, well, there's 2 things. I think things will straighten out. I think that eventually all this craziness will go back to a period where people just try to do good work. And I think the best thing we can do to our students is not to sugarcoat Islam or to show how it's this or that, but to show how it's this, how Islam is this multicultural, goes back to multicultural, multi-formed entity that we need to study the languages, we need to study the cultures. There's no such thing as a Muslim culture. There's cultures, there's languages. And I think another part is to just show what an integral part Islam is to Western civilization. So that's why I think, to me, the study of Islamic origins, rather than be this Orientalist fantasy, actually puts Islam at the emergence of so many crossroads or so many roads of the West: the development of Rabbinic Judaism, the ferment of orthodoxy in Rabbinic Judaism, charism, the Isawiyah. Philip could talk more about what's going on in Christian circles, but I think that Islam is formative to Western. So rather than have our students, you're talking about students, rather than have our students think that Islam is somehow, over there, what they do. I mean, that Islam is an integral part of Western civilization, which also goes back to your question, and both of your questions is, I mean, what better way to show Islam as part of Western civilization than look at like Lebanese farmers on the Canadian prairies, right? I mean, how many Canadians know that? And that really, to me, it's ridiculous. So that we have to, and that's why I think that both Orientalism has traditionally othered Muslims, but I also think all this really liberal that does the same thing. And I think the key is just to show that Muslims live lives, right? The way maybe we need to well, but people like Aziz Ansari, so we need to see Muslims like, we need to see them. We need like Muslim Larry Davids. Or, you know, we need to see shows like this where Muslims are us. And I think we're starting to do that.
There are a couple people that are standing out and, you know, making it okay or kind of attacking political tensions and issues, but I think it's a long way to go.
I do too, but I think we're at the front lines, and I think that rather we can take the low road, we can take the silly road, or we can take the high road, and to show Muslims at the not good Muslims, because I don't think there's such a thing as good Muslims or bad Muslims, but to show the intellectual heights to which Islam and Muslim thinkers have aspired over the years, right? I mean, there's Plato, there's Maimonides, Maimonides just. Excuse the non-kosher metaphor, I mean, just piggybacked on Al-Farabi and Avicenna.
One last question, please.
Yes. I've been teaching religious studies in schools for most of my life, and I'm really interested in the contribution that what you have to say really is outside of the academy. Because certainly in what I've seen, there has been this terrible rise in prejudice among young people and children as they've had this fed through the popular and the not so popular press. I mean, your critique, for example, of cosmopolitanism, I think is very, very interesting. But how do, I mean, so taking as a premise that we have great moral judgment of Islam, that you know is a secular sacred really written into that. You know, how do we, for a more popular audience, have a complex of rereadings really of concepts like democracy and the sorts of category that you have talked about being raised by Node? How do we, you know, disentangle that and deal with that for a wider public?
That is a great question. I mean, the intellectual, we always say, well, what we have to begin by doing is sort of dislodge terms like democracy and to show how problematic they are and how they're Western constructions and they're not the only way to look at the world. I deal with you know, young adults that come to the university that have, and I try to, so I'm privileged that way, and I work with very smart students. In fact, the students the students that I have to work with the most are students that come in thinking they know all there is about Israel, and so I kind of have to sort of slowly help them unlearn what they've learned. And usually they do if you do it properly. But the question of the school, yeah, I don't know how to. I mean, I think maybe one of the ways we have to go about it is to show Muslims in their everyday lives, and I think so. It has to be popularized. I think TV shows. I don't know what kind of TV shows. I think this is a good example. I'm not sure how many Muslim footballers there are in the English Premier League, but you know, we need to see more of this. But I mean, it strikes me that. I mean, it's such a shame to hear this because I mean, Canada is also a very multicultural place, but I don't see the. I mean, America is just a mess. I'll say that. But I would find it so difficult that there'd be such hostility amongst Muslims, and not in a place like London where there's so many Muslims. So why? I don't know how to help other than to say that we can take our categories and show them that these are, as I tried to begin the paper, right? I mean, why is democracy divinely given? I mean, because we've made it that way. But I don't know. I just think people need to see Muslims in their everyday. Yeah. So maybe that's maybe as I move forward that trying to correct these stereotypes. But I think at the university level, the way we have to do it is show how Islam is an integral part of Western civilization. And maybe a smaller version of that, or a more trickle-down version of that, has to occur at the curricular level in secondary schools or primary schools.
to some extent, is this been innovated by Israeli lobby in the United States? You say, I've been listening, saying about you were talking about the Campus Watch and all those bogus think tank. You say.
Well, Israel's always the elephant in the room for so many things. I think Daniel Pipes is Jewish, yeah. I mean, I think. I don't know if it's all part of constructed by the Israel lobby, but I think there are. I think that it's always sort of omnipresent because Israel. I mean, the Jewish lobby is fairly powerful.
Extremely powerful. It belongs to occupied territory of Washington and Congress.
Yeah. Well, I think but there's a healthy dose of skepticism, especially among Jewish intelligentsia. Like there's new camp like in J Street. There's new organizations forming with college
Moldovite
students.
and all that.
Pardon?
Moldovite.
Yeah. So there's a. But again, I think it's reaction, right? So a lot of liberal Jews are having such a problem with the way, like Steve Bannon addressed the Zionists of America. That bothers a lot of people. So I think that there are increasingly there's more liberal reactions to that. But I think that I think that's part of it. But I also think there are other issues. I wouldn't want to just blame Israel as a scapegoat. I think that there are other issues that have led to the negative portrayal of Muslims in the West.
Professor Hughes, thank you very much.
All right, thank you. Thank you, everybody.
That was wonderful. Thank you.